Well, thank you. I always like to tell people to, maybe you don't want to clap before you hear what I got to say, but thank you. What a beautiful building. And also, I'd like to thank the folks that have done the preservation work here. Pretty amazing what they've done, and really amazing to see that the cultural and heritage preservation work that has gone on in here. So thank you to them as well. And let me get into here. And moving. If you're having any trouble, the acoustics seem to be really good. If you're having any trouble hearing me, just let me know and I'll speak up a little bit. So we're going to be talking Finns for about 20 minutes here, and I want to try and definitely keep to 20 minutes so we don't get behind on anything. So I'm going to try real hard to maintain that 20 minutes. The one thing that I would like to say, this is going to be, as Veda mentioned, about 1880 moving into about the 1920s. And we all know, my dad grew up in Embarrass, we know the stories of the flying Finns. Most of us do. My dad sure does. And we know the story about how some unfortunate person married someone of Finnish background. My mom did that. So we have these stories and these conceptions about Finnish and what it means to be a Finn. But let's go back to when they first started making their way into the area. And that's what this presentation is going to be about. So we're going to be looking at immigration, why they were leaving.
Give your front of your projector.
Oh. Yeah. That's got to be like rule number one. Just kind of an early image of homesteading in northern Minnesota. And so the things that we're going to be discussing tonight, emigration and immigration push both factors. You may have heard other people refer to those before. Work life and organizational life. And some of this, many of you will be kind of familiar with, and some of it we'll be putting a little bit of a different spin on it. So, discussing first what pushed Finns out of Finland and what pulled them into Minnesota. And some of you may have heard that term before, Jack Pine Savages. That was a derogatory term that was used to speak about Finnish immigrants. And we're going to discuss why that was. To us, things like Solomon and things like that, seem very natural. But in the Victorian era U.S., not so much. So it was looked upon as being a little bit strange. But some of the push factors that were going on in Finland at the time, from very early on, Finland was a part of Sweden. And then during the Russo-Swedish Wars, 1806 to 1809, Russia took over. The Russian Empire took over. And it did not go well. In about the mid-1850s, there was a push for Finnish nationalization. That's where you see some of the great poetry and works come out of Finland that push for nationalization. And you had a gentleman like Nikolai Bobrikov, who was the Governor General of Finland, who was appointed by the Russian Tsar to overlook Finland. And so that was the one thing, a search for some identity. But then you also had other things, push things like, the son got the farmland, so everybody else had to go somewhere else. But then some interesting things in the southern areas, there was a so-called radical element. And in 1905 especially, we see Finns from the southern areas of Finland who basically left to avoid persecution. And so that's where you see, if you want kind of the nest egg for what many people in the U.S. came to know as the preceders to Gus Hall or the Hallford family or the Tuomias Publishing Company. It likely came from this radical element that left right around 1905 because there was a rebellion that occurred in Finland in the shipping yards in Viipuri, and a lot of those people either left or were told to leave. So some of the things that pulled Finns in, and there was roughly around 63,000 that ended up in Minnesota, roughly about 300,000 that came to the United States. So not a large immigrant population, but when we take a look here at where they settled, you'll see that it was large, but it was certainly kind of localized. Arnie Allen, who many of you may know, refers to this area of Lake Superior as the Finnish-American Riviera. Very aptly titled. The water's probably not quite as warm, but you can see that hugging that area of Lake Superior. And what kind of also connected that geography were the jobs. UP, I spent about 10 years up in the UP, copper mining, iron mining on the 3 ranges in the Upper Peninsula in Wisconsin, and then of course the industrial work that occurred here. But as many of us know, especially from where Finns are located, a lot of Finns are located around here in Maris, Toivola, Toimi, those areas, that wasn't the end game. The end game was getting a piece of land to call your own, and that's certainly what happened with my family as well. Got 40, 80, 160 acres, and you're able to be your own boss. And so these Jackpine savages, what were these weird things that they were doing? Well, in the Victorian era, 1880s up until 1910s, that was kind of an era that was dominated by a differentiation between the sexes. And so, you had the men's smoking room and all that. And you see some of that in Finnish hall culture. But one of the things that did happen was certainly men and women did not take baths together. What was going on in the sauna, but the whole dang family. They were in that thing together, seeing each other naked, and it was just, we had a lot of problems there. So that was one of the, and then some of the acts like pupuri, where you had massagers and healers that would kind of go from town to town, village to village. That came from Finland as well. And then there was also this kind of violence that also came along with Finnish immigrants. We have on the bottom there as a picture of 2 of the, there was a subculture in Finland that came out of knife fighting, pukos. And there was a knife fighting subculture that also came over to the U.S. as well. And so all of these things and the weird language wasn't a part of the Indo-European language family. It was a Finno-Ugric language. Strangely enough, Hungary is in that language family along with Estonian and a couple of other Sami languages. So there was a whole bunch of things that kind of made Finns look different. And there was this anti-Oriental legislation that was occurring with Chinese immigrants. Finns were lumped in. There was a push to lump Finns in with that as well because they were thought of as being from the Ural Mountains, and so they were the government tried to keep them out because of this. So all of this you add it together, plus we throw in the radical politics, and you have just a nice stew of neighbors of other ethnicities looking at Finns is a little bit strange. But they were also valued workers, and especially in industrial work, in mining, as we're all familiar with, logging. Logging was going on both in an industrial way, in the camps, but then also at home. And then, of course, farming, and that was a preferred occupation for a lot of Finns. Now, what's really interesting is this was kind of there was a seasonal work strategy that went along with this. And I traced it, especially one guy, a fellow by the name of Sam Swanson, who was up in Ely for a while, and he did an oral history. And he talked about his kind of yearly cycle. And he wasn't farming on his family farm, he would head out into the Dakota wheat fields during the harvest, and then after the harvest was done, he would go up into northern Minnesota and southern Ontario and do some logging during the wintertime, and then once breakup came, down into the mines, work there, and then, so there was this kind of yearly cycle that was going on. And that, of course, led itself to a lot of single bachelors that were moving around looking for work. And so, you know, the idea was to do that, get some money, get a place where you're going, where you can settle down, perhaps have a family, or go back to Finland with a little bit of extra change in your pocket and maybe get some land of your own in Finland. The migration return rate was something like, I think I've seen anywhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 5 would go back, sometimes multiple times. So it wasn't a static idea where people came, stayed, raised a family. There was a lot of going back and forth, sometimes multiple times. And of course, we oftentimes hear about all the difficult work in the logging camps and in the mining camps, and that certainly was true, but the work that women were doing was especially difficult as well, because the hours were worse if they were working in a boarding house as a domestic or a boarding house mistress, where you'd be doing all the clothes. You didn't really have a lot of time off, because oftentimes the mine workers were in shifts, and so they had to be up and awake and ready all the time to do things. But also the immigrant press. And this isn't just the labor press, but even some of the religious press involved women doing work that would oftentimes be associated with men, like being typesetters or binders, so kind of physical labor, but also editors. Tobertar was one newspaper that was a named Female Comrade, and it was being published all by women. And then so businesses, and this one I put in there is because of the cooperative stores. Cooperative stores were very, very interesting because you had all the different departments, so you needed the different people to represent those departments. So if there was women's clothes, of course you want somebody there. And I think that was probably also the first entry for a lot of women of different ethnic backgrounds into American stores as well. So if you had a place like Virginia here, you had a multi-ethnic clientele coming in, you wanted somebody who could be able to, you know, speak with. So I think as much as we like to think about multiculturalism and diversity being something that came along out of the goodness of people's hearts, sometimes I think it was a little more pragmatic than that as well. An example of that, my grandmother for a long time, and she was born in 1916 and lived to be 100 years old, spent a lot of her time working in one of those cooperative stores, but also working at the Aero shirt factory as well. So cultural organizations, and these are really interesting, especially in the Finnish immigrant community, because there was a lot of them. And there was a lot of them because there was a lot of debate over ideology, over function, and sometimes I have a feeling just over personality. And the cultural organizations were a way to alleviate some of that isolation and stress coming to a new world, but also social networks and a way to just meet with like-minded people. And because we were in Minnesota, the cooperative element was especially big. And a lot of those early labor and political organizations had their roots in these cooperative boarding houses, cooperative stores, and then we see the final kind of expression of that in the Savacoa Park as well. Just a real gem of historic, I don't want to say relic because it's still going, but the history of the Savacoa Park is pretty interesting. And so out of these cooperative ventures, we see the rise of the political organizations that also, the leftist political organizations were very, very interesting because they had that rise in the cooperative boarding houses. Men would get together at the end of the shift and talk about, well, this such and such a boss is really difficult, or why are we getting paid this while other folks are getting paid this? So that chit chat that was going on in the cooperative boarding houses surely led to this rise in political movement, but it was also the temperance societies. There was a conservative and a liberal wings to the temperance organizations. And out of that liberal wing of the temperance organizations, they started looking at things in materialistic meaning instead of in spiritual ways. And so instead of saying we'll wait until we pass on to receive our riches, the folks in the liberal temperance wing started saying, hey, why are we going to wait till then? There's some stuff that we could address now. And so out of that temperance organization came early Finnish socialist organizations. And then we get into those splitting and fractioning. We had parliamentarian wings, and we had direct action wings, the Industrial Workers of the World wing being one of those. And out of that socialist movement, we have the wing that was all for voting and mitigating change over time, something we would see as maybe as progressive today, to the revolutionary aspects, the folks that were in the Communist Party, the CPUSA. Many of you may know that not too far away from here in Cherry, Gus Husta Hallberg was born in 1910 from immigrant parents, and later by, I think it was 1980, was a general secretary of this Communist Party of the United States of America. So my mom, who wasn't Finnish, happened to know, be good friends with his niece, Judy Hallberg, and so she always referred to him as Uncle Gus. And my parents, I mean, they were strong Democrats, they were communists, but I always thought, okay, Uncle Gus, and she talked about him and all this. And then I got in a couple of political history classes and read about Uncle Gus. And like, holy cow, Uncle Gus was one of the most hated men in the United States during the Cold War. So that was interesting, but a very, very interesting history. And really a sidebar here, but they had a subsistence farm, and I had a friend from Finland who was an investigative journalist, and he did a history on Gus. He was doing a history on Gus Hall, and for many, many years, one of Gus's brothers was claiming that the CIA or the FBI or some government organization was poisoning his horses, or sterilizing his horses. And everybody was, this is the reporter friends, everybody said, you're crazy, that's not happening, why would they mess with that? He FOIA'd that those records, all the records of the Hall family from the U.S. government, sure as they were doing it. We found some evidence that was happening during the Cold War era. Yeah, that was a real sidebar. So all of this, the political activity, the temperance activity, the Knights and Ladies of Cullewa, who are, we have that great Cullewa Hall here in Virginia. Started off, of course, as a temperance hall. All of that revolved around this hall culture. And every little location had that hall. So we see, here's the Hersey Hall. I think that was out in Brimson. So we have these kind of unique log structures all the way up to the really ornate structures like what's now the Knights and Ladies of Cullewa Hall, but also the Socialist Opera House here in Virginia, the Hibbing Workers Hall. There are some over in Michigan as well. And what's unique about that is every one of these communities, if it was large enough, had at least 2 Finn halls in it. Sometimes maybe 3. Thunder Bay was really interesting because they had an IWW hall, which was called the Big Finn Hall. Right next to it was the Communist Hall. So right next to each other, there was 2 halls that were competing for membership up in Thunder Bay. And that border meant very little at that time, so there was people going back and forth. And you see the same names. What's really interesting, from the 1314 strike over in Michigan Copper Country, that was a big strike led by the WFM, to the 1916 strike here on the Iron Range. You see some of the same names. And it shows up in the labor press and the Duamias but also on some of the organizers. Even from the 1907 strike here, you see from 07 to 13, 14, 16, you see some of the same people sprinkled throughout that time. So that hall culture, you get those connections. We talked about the social networking. They didn't, of course, no Facebook or Instagram or any of that stuff my daughter uses. But there was those networks that were being developed, and a lot of that revolved around that hall culture. So integral to the immigrant experience, because in that hall culture we were having plays, gymnastics, sewing circles, literature, all of those things were going on. And so just really an important part of the immigrant experience. So with that, we'll move on. And I hope I kept it to right around 20 minutes.
Take your time, we're enjoying it.
Okay. Do we want to are we doing questions now, later, or?
I was thinking maybe we should do them later.
At the end.
Because it could get.
Okay. And you weren't using this? Is that...
Are you concluding now?
Yeah.
Oh, all right. Thank you.
I wanted to keep Oh, I should have. Kitos Palio means thank you very much.
Do I look Italian? No. You know, our very dear friend, Senator Gino Palucci. First of all, there's a longer story about how this group of people got together tonight to give these discussions. Some of you know Pamela Brunfeld, who is an expert on ethnic groups on the Iron Age, and she's made that part of her life's work. And we contracted her sometime in January, and at some point, I can't tell you when, she had a terrible accident and is now in assisted care. And we weren't able to contact her, and I was thinking if she could just give us her lecture, we'll of course make all the attributions to her, and it'll be a whole lot easier. But I was fortunate to be able to find Norman Sentiker, David Sentiker, and Gary Conlon was easy to find because he's going to be giving the speech about, or the whole discussion about the strike of 1916 that happened at the St. James Mine. And then Senator Tomassoni said that he would be happy to do the Italian one. Well, just a few days ago, he said, I just can't do it. I've got another thing I've got to do. And so here I am. I've done my best. So forgive me if I've got things backwards. I also want to mention that as I was sitting there in the back, a nice man came up and said, "You don't recognize me." I said, "No, I don't. Who are you?" He said, "I'm Bunky Gino." And Bunky's his nickname. Are you still called Bunky?
By people who know me.
But in any case, I said, "Oh my God, I'm talking about your great-grandmother in my speech. I used her as an example of chain immigration on the Iron Range." And so I'm just delighted to have somebody who's in the family, so to speak, here with us tonight. So, as a Slovenian girl growing up on the Iron Range, I was lucky enough to have friends from a dozen ethnic groups: Finns, Slovenes, Croats, Swedes, English, Jewish, and Italians among them. Sauna, pizza, and good spaghetti imported from Italy were available to all of us. In Aurora and in its mining locations, Miller Mine, Mohawk, Meadow, and St. James mines, there were significant Italian neighborhoods. Names like Biagio Fucci, Fondi, Fugina, Banacci, Coletti, Abana, Cuso, Cero, Gina, Descenzo, Brevet, Fontecchio, Viticinque. Those were all names that I grew up knowing, at least knew that they existed. And then just down the road from Aurora High School was a little location of St. James, and there was the house of Gino Palucci, and some of you know him, thinking that he's a hippie boy, but he actually was born in Aurora and grew up there. Those of you who don't know him, he was a young, aggressive, smart, and creative man who began the first major Asian food company in the United States called Chungking Foods. And we'll talk more about him a little bit later. When I moved to the East Coast, the ethnic mix in New Jersey resembled in many ways my experiences on the range, especially with a large percentage of Italians. When preparing for this little discussion about immigration to the Iron Range, I was very surprised to find out how very few Italians immigrated to greater Minnesota. Although Italian immigrants began arriving in the territory that would become Minnesota 200 years ago, they came in very small numbers compared to the migration to the northeastern states. And many first lived in other states before moving to Minnesota. Railroad work brought Italians to St. Paul and also to the town of Cumberland, Wisconsin, which was some sort of a juncture of railroads, and then they came to Minnesota after they'd been there. Early arrivals in the cities tended to be from northern Italy, such as plastic image vendors from Tuscany in St. Paul making Cupid dolls, and stoneworkers from Lombardy who settled in Duluth. In 1860, there were fewer than 100 Italians living in the Twin Cities. Later, at the beginning of the 20th century, immigrants found work in the mines in the Iron Range, creating the largest pocket of Italian immigration in the state of Minnesota. So to recap, in 1857, according to some sources, there were only 48 Italians in Minnesota. In 1890, there were 262. By 1920, there were 5,000 Italians living on the Iron Range alone. So that's a huge number. Of that number, the greatest preponderance of these Italians were working in the mines. Others were entrepreneurial in their makeup and gravitated to small businesses, especially selling fruit and produce or operating grocery stores. A scholar named John Andriozzi has made a fascinating survey of the home provinces of these Italian immigrants, and we will see that even within the Italian immigration patterns, there were the haves and the have-nots. On the Iron Range, the have-nots were the largest percentage. Northern Italians were the first to arrive and came primarily from 4 provinces: Piedmont, Trenti, Marchigiani, and Tuscany. By 1930, there were 10,000 Italians living on the range, the largest preponderance from just one province, Alto Adige, in the northern part of Italy, the mountainous area that borders Switzerland. The reasons, perhaps, I don't know exactly what it is, but I'm guessing, the reasons for this large group of immigrants from that small region is because it was also a mining and quarrying region, and perhaps because it was in its early days, in the beginning of the 1800s, it was ruled by the Habsburgs, which included what is now Slovenia, and included Trieste first. Certainly, word travels, and after the representatives of the iron mining industries had exhausted exporting all the Slovenes that it could, undoubtedly, they looked at the next best place, which was northern Italy. Just as with the Slovenes, the Italians sent scouts out to the Minnesota mines, and after settling in, would send for family members. I know that Gary mentioned this huge number of males, and it's true. In every group it was so. Boarding houses were loaded with single men and created all kinds of havoc, in the community, and that wasn't very popular. We call it chain migration today, but it describes the pattern of immigration that obtained at the time. The range had an overwhelming percentage of single men living in boarding houses operated by overworked women, many with their own large brood of children. As I was looking through the Italian names in the census report, I'd have to give you a name here or two. The Gravet family, she had 4 children living at the little houses in Meadow mining location, and she had 7 boarders. Can you imagine? You got 4 kids, and you're taking care of 7 boarders at the same time in houses that today, if you had 1 child or 2 children, you'd say it's too small. So those were the lives of the women. Very hard for every immigrant woman, there's no question. As the years went on, families were established with wives arriving from Slovenia or Italy, and some of the cultural advances were made by establishing churches, civic organizations, and of course reaping the benefits, the real benefits of the extraordinary schools of the Iron Range. The Anglo-American community leaders looked down on Southern European immigrants, including Italians. They objected to the immigrants' congested living situations, imbalanced sex ratios because of the huge percentage of single men, perceived immorality and association with political radicalism. The fact that many immigrants were Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox or Jewish caused further anxiety. Local chapters of the Ku Klux Klan developed in the 1920s in opposition to Catholic and Jewish immigrants. The Italians on the range had the burden of doing the most menial and the toughest and most unrewarding physical labor, always at the bottom of the pecking order in the mining hierarchy, as well as being the recipients of abuse from immigration officials, mining officials, and the general public. There could be, for example, not even one mining foreman or pit boss for extended periods of time. These jobs going first to the Cornish miners and then to the Austrians/Slovenes. In investigating Italian immigration, I was shocked as my mother would say, to read of discussions by schools and the legal system in their description of the immigrants. They were called black immigrants, not to be confused with African Americans. There were black Finns and black Southern Europeans. There were also some census takers who would use the offensive term mulatto when assigning race to Jews or Italians. Textbooks used in Mondavi schools describe Southeastern Europeans as primitive people, culturally retarded, and highly criminal. Elsewhere, these modes of thinking guided arguments related to skin color, but on the Mondavi, they applied to the differentiation of Southern European immigrants, which included Italians, Croatians, Montenegrins, and Serbs as well. The Minnesota establishment believed the best workers were the Cornishmen. Next were the Finns, although there were court battles to identify them as members of the white race. Gary mentioned this. It was shocking, again, I was so surprised at what I'm learning. Because of their ancient relationship to Siberian Asians, that qualified them in some legal documents as member of the yellow race. And it took a legal decision by the Minnesota courts to determine that the Finns were white enough to become citizens. One can only imagine then what kind of difficulties were faced by Italians. If the Finns weren't white enough, what do you say about Italians? So, they took refuge in their churches and in their social clubs. In larger cities, for example, there were usually separate Catholic churches for Irish, for Slovenians and Croatians and Italians. Immigrants continued to speak in their native tongues. They resided in ethnic clusters. They married partners of the same nationality. On the range, the Italians built three important architectural sites: the Immaculate Conception churches in Hibbing and in Evelyn, and the Sacred Heart Parish in Virginia. Unlike some of the Italian parish churches in other parts of the state of Minnesota, these three churches still stand, adding to the physical beauty of our range cities. Italian immigrant jobs outside of mining were primarily in the food service industries: grocers, fruit sellers, winemakers, candy makers, restaurateurs. Part of it is because it was possible for a cigar maker, for example, to have a tiny physical space, small address, from which to sell what might be called variety items. In Aurora, for example, it was Chero's, named after its owner, Sonny and Francis Chero, where decades of young people went in the 40s and the 50s to sit at the soda fountain and drink Green Rivers, Cherry Cokes, and buy popsicles and musicals. Typically Italian businessmen, eking out their livings one ice cream bar at a time, were also extremely charitable people. All across the range, the names of Italian businessmen were and still are associated with philanthropy. From Gino Palucci in Aurora and Hibbing, the Palucci Foundation donated annually to the Northern Lights Music Festival. To the Martiranos in Chisholm, who have their own foundation, smaller merchants like the Lacaris in Boavic, and smaller merchants like the Colettis and Cheros in Aurora. Other occupations for those working on the main streets were those of musicians. An important contribution to culture was made on the Iron Range by Francesco Amendola, who was the conductor of the Iron Range Symphony from 1922. I don't know. I can't find it. So if somebody knows when the Iron Range Conservatory closed or went out of business, and whatever happened to Mr. Amendola, I'd be so interested to know. He had something called the Lombardy Conservatory of Music in Hibbing. This orchestra toured throughout northern Minnesota, and it was only in the last year I was looking at some old editions of the Aurora High School newspaper, and on the cover, the first page, it said that the Iron Range Symphony was coming to do a concert at Aurora High School. That must have been, well, the high school was built in, 1922, I think it opened, so something after that, maybe the 27th edition. And it was considered the crowning jewel of the year's cultural activities. Religious societies and volunteer work created an outlet for women's bonding and friendships. There were few places for a respectable woman to go. But ironing linens for the church and being a member of an altar society was a possibility to leave behind the broods of children without her husband complaining about their absence. After all, the priest needs it, then it's got to be okay. So I've looked at these societies over the years, and I thought many times, it had to have been a relief in some way for them to go and be quiet and go about their business in the church and have a chance to gossip a little bit without the stress of someone saying, shouldn't you do this, tie my shoe, make me tea, whatever happens in the house. Men had their saloons, which were considered somewhat respectable, a place to have a beer after work, but women had no such outlet. Later, one of the most prominent members of the Italian community, Katie Rukopina, became a primary leader of the labor movement on the range. We have in our Aurora history, which includes mining locations, as I mentioned, at least one historical record of what we call chain migration. Buried at the Forest Hill Cemetery in Aurora is the matriarch of the Abenat, Coletti, and China families. Let's trace her journey and her influence. She was born Magdalena Abagnato in Palermo, Sicily in 1865. She died in January 22nd, 1962, living to the amazing age of 98. Her father was Giovanni Cina, and her mother's maiden name was Vincenza. Her husband, Antonino, little Anthony Abagnato, was 12 years older than she and died in 1905 in Sicily of pneumonia. He was a grower and a grafter of new types of fruit. They had 8 children, all born in the city of Mandello in Sicily. And immediately after the death of Antonino, 3 members of the family, Samuel, Emma, and Josephine, came to Aurora, sent as scouts, I might say. In 1907, Mother Magdalena, Florence, John, Steve, Tony, and Jenny joined the first group. Her brother, Steve Cina, was here in 1905, married to another Emma, 20 years younger than he. The 2 families, the Abenats and the Cinas, became very important families in Aurora, pushing their children to high academic achievement, sending almost every one of their children to college. Tony Abenat became a star athlete and musician and passed away not so long ago in the state of Iowa, where he taught orchestral music in the public schools for more than 50 years. Frederick Cina was an attorney, his father, served as city attorney in Aurora for decades and as a member of the Minnesota House of Representatives. One daughter, Vincenza Abagnato, called Jenny, married Antonius Coletti and added another Italian family to the neighborhood. Their children, Mario and Providenza, anglicized to Pearl, ran Coletti's market for 50 years and provided prime meats, imported Parmigiano cheese, and imported spaghetti to the Aurora White Lakes community. The parents, including Magdalena Abagnato, came from the poverty of Sicily and brought forward their children as musicians and scholars and athletes by their association with the Iron Range schools and its myriad opportunities. I had reason to look up Tony Abenat a few years ago for the Aurora, Mondavi East Sports Hall of Fame. And I mentioned it before, and I think it's worth repeating, that when I looked at the football team, it was Tony Abenat and Morris Wiener and Vernon Olson and 5 names. And then you look at who was on the track team, and it was Tony Abenat and Vernon Olson and Morris Wiener and the other 2. I'm just having a moment when I can't come up with their names. And it occurred to me that, if you were a varsity athlete, you had to be in school. So where were all of those big, strong Croatian guys? Where were all those, tall basketball players? Where were the strong Slovenians? Where were they? They were in St. James Mine, right there on the other side of the school. They quit school in the 8th grade. So the fact that you had Abenats and Ginas all doing varsity sports and excelling academically meant that their parents didn't want them in the mines. Their parents wanted them to excel and to exceed, and they did. And I can't even imagine how they managed to do it, to put 8 or 10 kids through college, even at a time when tuition was very, very low. It was something remarkable. So that family, was an amazing family. Over the years, the name was spelled a dozen different ways, the family finally setting on Abbanat. When she died, her obituary said the following: survivors include 4 sons, 3 daughters, 20 grandchildren, including State Representative Fredchina of Aurora, 35 great-grandchildren, and 4 great-great-grandchildren. That's a grand total of 62 persons still living after her passing at age of 98. Doubtless there were many who preceded her in death. In 1930, in Hibbing, 16% of the Italians had already intermarried with non-Italians. Hibbing had a population of 15,000 people at that time, of which 1,700 were Italian. Almost all of these Italians had jobs working as labor in the mines. Only 27 persons at that moment were professional, semi-skilled, or in business. Several were female stenographers, yet the children excelled, thanks to iron range schools. I must mention a book here by Mary Ellen Mancina Batinic, who directed an oral history project called Italian Voices that collected interviews in the late 1970s with the men and women who emigrated from Italy to Minnesota. The interviews provide a window into the world of the ordinary Italian immigrants, ranging from iron miners, labor activists, women at home and at work, small businessmen and women and people from all walks of life. And in this book, she outlines the life of Gino Palucci. As I mentioned, Gino was born in Aurora in 1918, just a few years after his family emigrated to the United States from Italy and to the Iron Range. They came from a small mining town in northeastern Italy called Bellucci sul Fare. Gino began his career selling olive oil door to door. During Prohibition, his family ran a speakeasy out of his family's basement on the Iron Range. He did all he could to help, even making most of the wine himself. After this chapter in his interesting life, he moved to Duluth at the age of 16 and began a job bartering fruit and vegetables on First Street. He enrolled at Hibbing Junior College, but decided that he would rather sell wholesale products after having been given that opportunity, and left his education without a second thought. On a sales trip with his company, he learned to grow Chinese bean sprouts, with which he started his new worldwide company, Chungking Foods. His business was worth $450 million when he sold out to Reynolds. After a few years, he created another Italian food line, including Gino's Pizza, and then another brand, Michelina's Frozen Meals, named after his mother. This brand is still in the supermarkets. I'm sure you see it in the frozen food aisles from time to time. Another famous Italian is Robert Mondavi, whose parents emigrated from the marsh region of Italy and settled in Hibbing. Mondavi was actually born here in Virginia, Minnesota. His mother ran a boarding house for local Italian laborers, and his father was a proprietor of a grocery store and later a saloon. However, Prohibition came in 1919, which outlawed the sale of beer and liquor, threatening Mondavi's business. The law allowed for individuals to produce up to 200 gallons of wine for their own use or for religious purposes. So they would make contracts with the churches and with families, and he became a great wholesaler for many Italian families who wanted to continue enjoying the traditional wine with meals. Mondavi's business often took him to the West Coast, so in the early 1920s, the family relocated to Lodi, California, south of Sacramento. Maybe with global warming, the company will come back to Minnesota. And the last example I'm going to give you is more recent. The son of a maintenance foreman at an iron ore smelting plant, Roger Enrico was born in 1944 in the small town of Chisholm, Minnesota. Growing up, Enrico often heard his father comment that it made little sense to him why management at the smelting plant didn't listen to the ideas of those who worked in the shop. These words would stay with Enrico later in his career. During high school, he took his first job working at a local soft drink bottling plant, and after many, many steps up the career ladder, he became president and CEO of PepsiCo Beverages and Food, Then he was promoted to the PepsiCo Worldwide Beverages as CEO, and then finally was the chairman of PepsiCo from 1996 to 2001, and chairman of DreamWorks Animation, and was well known for his business rivalry with fellow businessman Roberto Goizetta, whose name I'm probably mispronouncing because I've never heard anybody say it out loud, the CEO of Coca-Cola during his tenure as Pepsi's CEO. All of that from the son of a maintenance worker in Chisholm, Minnesota. He passed away in 2016 while snorkeling in the Cayman Islands, where he had a home. So, Italians, from Marco Polo in 1254 to the Gino Palucci's and the Robert Mondavis are by their natures entrepreneurial, and their contributions to the Iron Range of Minnesota can be summed up by their back-breaking work ethics in the mines and the business acumen that created restaurants, food industries, and captains of industries. Speaking personally, as somebody who enjoys good Italian food, I'm always happy to get a meal at Valentini's in Chisholm. It's every bit as good as eating in South Philly. Viva Italia! And next we have Norman Setniker to speak about South Slavs.
Thanks, Mira. Yes, I'm Norm Setniker. I grew up in Milwaukee. I see Billy China there. I never Billy played against him in football. And I see a former neighbor of mine, Tom Madsen. Tom lived across the street from my grandfather, who was an immigrant from what was then Austria-Hungary, but was part of Slovenia, Pohogravic, Slovenia. I'm going to be talking about some patterns of Slovenian migration into Minnesota, as well as into the Iron Range, with emphasis on probably the Slovenians and the Croatians. These are probably the two largest groups of what is called the South Slav group. And if you remember that these South Slav countries were one country, Yugoslavia. The word Yugoslavia means, Yugo means south, South Slavs. So the Montenegros, the Serbs, the Croatians, the Slovenes, Bulgars, they were all part of what was once Austria-Hungary and then became Yugoslavia in 1918, and Slovenia became its republic only 30 years ago, 1991. They celebrated, and in June 25th of 2021, Slovenia celebrated their 30th anniversary as a free republic. So that was a big step. We've made 5 trips to Slovenia. And I recall in 1994, my brother Dave, myself, my wife Marianne, went to Slovenia, and there was what they call the World Slav Day, Slovenian Day. And we were at Postojna. And if any of you have ever gone to Slovenia, the Postojna Caves is kind of a magnet for a lot of the tourist industry. We were standing around, drinking, listening to Slovenian music on the button box, or as I was told later on, the diatonic accordion. And so we were approached by a Slovenian family. Father and the mother and 2 kids, all dressed in, at that time, narodnonosha, their costumes, their native costumes. So the mother comes up and she kind of nudges me a little bit and she says, "What part of America are you from?" And I said, "Well, we're from Minnesota. Oh, I know somebody from Minnesota. I says, Minnesota's a lot bigger than Slovenia. Of course, Slovenia now is about 2 million people only. And I says, do you know the town? Do you know a town named Bellucci? True story. David will attest to that. He almost falls off the table. Bellucci? I know all the Slovenians in Bellucci. Of course, Bellucci that's pretty small. But I says, I know all the Slovenians. I says, who do you know? Do you happen to know a Matty Anzels? Matty Anzels, I says, was my dad's best man when he got married. Plus, Matty and his brother John Anzels and my first cousin Ron Setniker had a group called the Polka Chimes. And I went into my bag and I pulled out 3 CDs. I said, is this the Matty Anzels that you know? And sure enough, they just threw up their hands. The family name was Sonia Laboda. They were from Komnik. And the 4 trips that we made after that to Slovenia, they invited us every time, and we stayed there. The last trip was in 2018, where we stayed with my granddaughter and my daughter, as well as Marianne and I stayed with them for a week, and just had a great time. And of course, they cooked for us. Sonia left work just to come home at noon to prepare a meal for us. I mean, it was just great hospitality. But I wanted to share that story because it shows you the connection between the Iron Range and Slovenia. The first time we went to Slovenia, we went to Belgrade looking for our relatives who were still there. But I told David, I says, you know, the names on the signs that we see, they're just like the Iron Range. Potočnik, Setnikar, only they spelled it Setnikar, which is the Slovenian way of speaking, not my name, as my dad had it Cker, and my first cousin had it Ker. So same family, 3 different spellings, but the true one was Setnikar. And of course, if you know a lot of Slovenian names, that ending of AR is very pronounced. Many, many names with that ending. Now, coming into Minnesota, there were basically 3 groups or 3 locations of these immigrants. The first one was in the 1860s, early 1860s, a group of Slovenians settled in the area of what is known today as St. Stephen. You probably have not heard, where's St. Stephen? Never heard of that. It's west of St. Cloud. It is the oldest Slovenian community in the United States. Close to St. John's, west of St. Cloud. We were just there. They celebrated 150 years of their church at St. Stephen. And the singing Slovenes from Duluth came and sang, and we had the Slovenian ambassador visit. So St. Stephen was really the place where Minnesotan Slovenians kind of started from. Families like Trobits. The Trobits family. My cousin from Slovenia had come a few years back, and he visited St. Stephen, and they had a service, a mass, and one of the parishioners was named Trobits, and my cousin got up and said, Trobits, they live just down the street from me in Pohovgradec. And that was true. And there was a bishop, Trobits, that all the Slovenians know. So that was nice to hear those names like Trobits, Pogachnik. I always think good Slovenian name, Pogachnik. When I was trying to learn the language, and I didn't do very well, but I was always telling the teacher, you know, you can tell really good Slovenian language by the sound of it. And when I first took the class, and Marianne was with me, and she said, and the teacher said, used the term, yes, we went to the Gledališća. That is a Gledališća. It sounds real Slovenian. Well, it's a theater. And so those kinds of things kind of just attached to me, and I don't speak very well with the Slovenian language, but it's kind of inbred as a part of me. So that was the first migration pattern, 1860s. Then you have the 1880s to the 1920s, where you had the group of Slovenians and Croats, Montenegros, coming in to the mining industry. And Ely, Tower Sudan were the origins of those groups. There was also a group of Slovenians that went to South St. Paul, the meatpacking area. So that was another area that many times people don't think of the Twin Cities having a lot of Slovenian background. Well, that is one. So those were the three major patterns. And by the early 20th century, most of the immigrants that had come into Minnesota, about 85% were Slovenians and Croats that had come to northern Minnesota. 1918, following World War I, Yugoslavia becomes a country. There's no more Austria-Hungary. There were more South Slavs that returned to the homeland to visit their families. That you always think of the Slovenians leaving their country, but there were a lot that went back to visit and to perhaps stay more permanently. When the Slovenians first came in, it was mostly men, as most of you have already heard. The ratio was just out of sight in terms of the number of men. And they would leave their wives in their homeland. The South Slavs were characterized as ambitious, self-uprooted. They immigrated for economic reasons, largely. They had to make money. And one of the major thrusts of Slovenian migration to Minnesota came through Slovenian missionary priests. People like Father Pirc, P-I-R-C. You may have seen in Minnesota the German spelling, P-I-E-R-Z. That's in central Minnesota, close to St. Cloud. But Father Pirc drew a lot of Slovenians from Austria-Hungary to come to St. Stephen to begin with, because of the rich farming area that it offered. Then, from Father Pirc, you had Father Buch, B-U-H, Buch. And Father Buch started the parish in Tower Sudan in the 1880s. He started the parish in Bellucci, and he was a great missionary priest that through newspapers sent to Europe, he was able to get a lot of not only priests but other immigrants to come to the United States. Father Buch started the St. Anthony Catholic Church in Ely. He also started the first newspaper, the Slovenian newspaper, Amerikanski Slovenec, and he also published the first book in Tower. One of the groups that kind of sort of coalesced to become to make some progress of working together and living together was the fraternal organizations that became very strong, especially up in the Ely and Tower area. In 1904, they started what was called the SNPJ, which were free-thinking socialists-minded Slovenians who objected to older Catholic lodges, like the KSKJ. They objected to older Catholics' insistence at Mass and at confession. The first lodge was in Ely. It gave equal benefits toward women. It became the largest Slovenian group in Minnesota with 15 lodges in Minnesota with 2,300 members. Slovenes also came on the political scene. George Brozic is the first Slovenian mayor in Ely in 1916. Up to 1968, 10 mayors in Ely were Slovenians. Mentioned also in Chisholm, John Blotnick, Congressman Oberstar, staunch Democrats that gave a lot of vitality to the Iron Range and were of Slovenian ethnic origin. The South Slavs were the dominant group on the Mondavi Iron Range. And when the commercial mining operations started in the 1890s, the Mondavi Range was a wilderness of forests and swamps. In 1910, 13 communities contained 50,000 residents. 3,600 were Slovenes, 3,400 were Croats, 2,650 were Montenegrins, and 550 Serbs, and then some 30 other national, regional, or ethnic groups. With the opening of the second mine on the Iron Range, Bellucci started shipping ore in 1893, which ironically was the year of the Great Depression in Minnesota. 1893 was really a disastrous for the range. And so things slowed down. Father Boo, who at that time was operating in the Boabic area and Tower area, made an observation that he said there were 5 families of what he called Austrians who survived on flour and water for 2 weeks because they did not speak English and did not know where to get help. I thought that was kind of interesting because, you know, the range has always been kind of taking care of their own, but because they didn't speak the language, they were kind of out on the fringes. By 1907, the Oliver Mining Company, which was the big one, 84% of their workers were foreign-born, and the South Slavs had over 30% of their workers were foreign-born. A survey of Croats in 1908, almost 50% of the Croats in that survey were making wages of $12 to $15 a week. Seasonal work in the open pit mines made regular unemployment or employment uncertain. Less than 49% were employed for a full 12 years. Nearly 17% workers less than 6 months. By contrast, 69% of Slovenian workers worked year-round in underground mines, and 51% made between $15 and $17 in a week. The South Slav population, the sex ratio on the Mondavi in 1885 was 250 men to 100 women, which was a big divergence. There was one statistic I came across where with the Serbs, it was 25-1. In one of the reports that I had read, one of the earliest Serbs to settle in the Hibbing area recalled that he had been there for three years before he saw a woman of his own nationality. Because many South Slav men left their spouses in their homeland, as well as low rates of nationalization for citizenship, men thought their stay would be temporary. Well, once they started to make a little money and they didn't want to go back, then they would start to look for other women from other ethnic groups. And of course, some of that, I remember my brother-in-law, Al Croatian, married a Finn girl. Ooh.
Yeah.
Mary Ann's folks are full Slovenian, and of course my folks were full Slovenian. And I was spoken to in many ways. Stay away from the Finns. But needless to say, Chuggy, or Al, married a Finnish girl, Renee Groshek, and had a good marriage. You know, but there was always that little bit of uncertainty on how that was all going to turn out. And of course, the other part was religion. You know, and Slovenians were mainly Catholic. Serbs, a little bit more Eastern Orthodox. Croats, again, a little more Catholic. But of course, the Finns, you know, you had the large Lutheran contingency. So, and there wasn't that much difference. I mean, except if you were strict with, especially the Finns. A little bit about the forming of communities on the range. We've heard a couple of stories about the boarding houses. They usually consisted of 3 rooms on one floor, 1 bedroom on the second floor. The second floor would house the workers, sometimes 10, 12, 20 guys on the second floor, with local mines working 2 shifts. Men who worked night shift came back at 6 o'clock in the morning, had breakfast and went to bed. Many times, 2 men to a bed. Boarders paid $3 a month for cooking, washing, and sometimes patching. While the grocery bill was divided equally by boarders and usually cost them between $12 and $15 a month per person. For married couples who had boarding houses, it was a valuable source of income. Average Croat boarding house yearly income was $1,370. Slovenians' average yearly income was smaller. They did not have a lot of boarding houses. And their average was $869, according to the sources that I used. Of the 49 Croat families living in Minnesota range towns, 47% owned their own homes. Of the 28 Slovenian families, 71% owned their own homes. Another drawing part towards community were the saloons. In 1909, the Immigration Commission counted 356 saloons in 15 towns on the Mondavi range. 91 were run by South Slavs, 48 by Slovenes, 34 by Croats, 8 Montenegrins, and 1 Serb. And I'm sure you can, my dad went to Zoller's. He was Zoller's bar, and you could walk in at any time and you'd see it right down the line. In fact, my brother made a joke when we went to Slovenia for the first time because we went into Gostilna, which is a bar near Polandgradec. And David came, he saw these guys sitting at the bar, and just like Joža, Janis, and Franca. You know what I mean? Any of those three names could have been in the range bars as well. But the saloons were not only places of drinking establishment, but again, you'd find out information about wages, opportunities for work, lodging available, having documents explained, letters translated. There are pool halls, card rooms, dance halls, and there were ethnic music in saloons up until probably the 1970s. So sometimes some of these accordion players would stick to these range bars. And then, of course, you had the ethnic stores. Gilbert, I thought, was always the perfect example of the ethnic stores. You had, dear, help me with the Italian one. Cristianos in Gilbert. Then you had Kobe's, Slovenian, Lop's, Slovenian. Hersturks, yes. And Koshers, but today we still go. But again, as of late 1937, more than 30 grocery and meat markets still were operated by South Slavs in 7 towns on the 3 ranges. And Gilbert, of course, had a few, Boavic and Ely. Ethnic bars, funeral homes, insurance agents were other transitional businesses in community. And of course, there were all these other fraternal groups that we at least alluded to. As far as labor organizations on the iron ore industry, they were slow in developing. Number one, intimidation from mining companies was one of the reasons. The growth of labor organizations occurred with the rise of socialist movements in the 1900s to 1906. Relations between the socialist Finns and the South Slavs were mixed, even though they took the lead in trying to organize labor groups. South Slav socialists were not as numerous as the Finnish groups. They built no halls on the range, a couple, but they only formed 3 clubs on the range. Chisholm, Aurora, Ely were affiliated with the South Slav Socialist Federation by 1910. And of course, you heard Mr. Cunnerman talk about the Finnish halls. These were great organization places to, again, talk about labor workers, or in actions. The 1907 and 1916 strikes had long-lasting effects. The failure of the 1916 strike deferred attempts to unionize mining until the CIO came about, tried to set or do something in 1936-37. Then you get into the period of World War I, Americanization. There's a period characterized by anti-labor, anti-foreigners, anti-Catholic hysteria. United States involvement in 1917 triggered an assault on immigrant groups. The Austrians were one of the groups that they picked on right away because, if you recall, in World War I, the Austrians were on the side of the Germans. And being that Austria-Hungary was owned or had all these South Slavs in that organization, they were considered kind of outsiders, so to speak. The South Slavs were considered Austrians, which at this time was the enemy. A Serbian immigrant in Chisholm recalled that there was a conspicuous difference between native-born Americans and us immigrants. and native-born quickly formed stereotypes of Southern Slavs. One magazine stated, their presence acted, listen to these words. One magazine said, their presence acted as dead weight, pulling down the wage scale for American workers. Further South Slav immigration should be prevented. Now we're in 2100 or 2021, and you hear these arguments with, again, different groups. Of course, the Minnesota Slavs, and again, I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but were very loyal to the Allies during World War I, buying bonds, support for the Republic of Yugoslavia, some returned to Europe to fight. Public schools stepped up to teach English to immigrants. American cooking schools were set up in the schools to Americanize the immigrant population more. In conclusion, I strongly believe that what I'm going to say is actually happened. In a broad sense, ethnicity concerns the cultural baggage people carry through, including their decisions on what to discard or retain. By whatever definition one adopts, ethnic survival among South Slavs in Minnesota is difficult to measure with precision. In the 1980s, religion, food, music were probably the most obvious examples of cultural persistence. Petitsa, button box, or diatonic accordion. By the way, I was going to tell you that the diatonic, I tried to learn how to play the accordion. And there's an instructor in Burnsville by the name of Helmy Harrington. She has an accordion museum in Superior. And I went to try and learn, and Marianne's folks had brought 2 Slovenian accordions back. One was a Slok Zupan, and I said, well, we should try to learn how to play this. You know, actually, I don't have any music background at all. My cousin had it, my dad had it. But anyhow, the first time I went to take a lesson, I had the accordion and I pulled it out, and she says, Norm, you got to remember how to take it out, and you have to remember how to take it in. And don't call it a button box, it's a diatonic accordion, or harmonica. If you pull it out, it's one note. If you go in, it's another note. So that's where the diatonic concept comes. And if I was going to talk about Slovenian music, I was going to use that as the prop that spread throughout Minnesota, the accordion. Father Perkovich with the polka mass, and all the button box clubs that roamed around the range. So, when you talk about this cultural persistence, Petitsa, diatonic, accordion music, the polka mass of Father Perkovich, the tamburitsa, orchestras, sarmas, some Christmas and Easter traditions and customs, languages especially, and this is interesting, I think, that the English language, or the Slovenian language, showed a marked decline in usage. And the one ethnic group whose language persevered, and I could see it through my friends, was the Finns. The Finns had the language that kept going, and Yes, I mean, be proud. I mean, I think, and you can see the result of that. Minnesota or you go to Orchestra Hall, you have a Finnish conductor, you have Finnish hockey players. I mean, the tradition of Finns is remarkable. And I look back at my Slovenian heritage. Well, we have one Slovenian hockey player in the National Hockey League. And his name is Kopitar, Andrzej Kopitar in America. We would say, the Slovenians would say Kopitar. He plays for the Los Angeles Kings and is a captain. And then in basketball, the lone Slovenian, or I think there's maybe two Slovenian basketball players, Luka Doncic, who is is taking Slovenia to the first Olympic Games. They just beat Lithuania, and so they're going. So anyhow, that's all I have to say, and that's it.
Thank you. The two of us, and Gary Cowden didn't get enough. Do you have any questions for Gary Cowden about the Finnish immigration since he's here? Anybody have questions? Nobody has questions? We were so exhausted that we don't have to have any questions? Nobody? How about anything else? Anything?
This lady has.
Hello?
I had a question about, where did he go?
He's standing here.
I had a question, the way when you, early in your speech, you referenced the co-op stores and that an individual would be in charge of like the clothing and whatever. So it made it sound like people came together but to sell their own stuff, like in artists do sometimes.
No, the co-ops are really interesting because like everything else in Finnish America, they split. And so there was what was sometimes the same town had a white co-op and the red co-op. And it was very centralized, especially the red co-op. And so they had their own, in a lot of cases, their own co-op brands. And so it was very centralized. You bought from the CCW or the Co-op Central. CCW is located in Superior, the Central Co-op wholesaler. And then so those were then brought and were sold in the stores, probably with some other things, but it wasn't like a kind of a farmer's market, not that I know of anyways. There was a farmer's market. And interestingly, what I always found really interesting about the communist, or the red co-ops, was that they had different grades of qualities. So they had, the idea behind that communism is that everything is equal. Well, you could buy the Red Star brand, you could buy the Yellow Star brand, you could buy the Black Star brand. So there's different tiers of goods according to quality, which to me was interesting. But they were highly centralized, so and probably the largest co-op, one of the largest co-ops in the Midwest was the Cloquet co-op. They had a really well-developed, they had their hands in just about every co-op gas station. They had co-op tire sales, the dry goods and all of that type of stuff, but also some other enterprises. It was very, very well developed. So Cloquet was kind of a model for, and some of the early immigrants, a guy by the name of Severi Alane, ended up moving from the strictly the Finnish immigrant co-op to being, he kind of wrote the Bible for the cooperative movement in America. And so that co-op was very, very important, but I don't believe it was kind of like had that farmer's market, like as we think of a co-op today as being kind of like a health foods or something like that. It was much more encompassing, and it was one of the great quotes from that was, "Sooner or later you're going to be a cooperator," And so it was a lifestyle, it was a value that people had. But not so much that I think it was where people would come and sell individual things.
We had a pretty good size one in Ely, and we could buy gas there. I remember it as being, I don't know when it's closed, at least 20 years ago, maybe more. But I think of it as a grocery store. It was like mostly any other grocery store,
Yeah.
as I recall.
They were even doing, I think the Croquet one was even doing home heating, like petroleum fuels that they'd go and, so it was really a huge venture.
Yes, David?
Yeah, I'm just going to add, everybody here probably has grown up with, at some point, and used more frequently when you're younger and around our parents. And this has been kind of indelibly etched. The question, if we didn't know who somebody was, the question was, what are you? My wife Bonnie, who's Scotch-Irish, came back here for the first time. And she no sooner walked in the door, she had never met my mother before. And my mother had the pizza and tea and some strudel all laid out and stuff like this. And I think we just put our luggage down and doing a few pleasantries, and then my mother, who never minced too many words, said, "What are you?" And Bonnie just, she didn't know how to answer. So but that actually, I really look at people that I haven't met. I love looking at names, and even if I just ask myself, I wonder what nationality they're.
Well, I have to say that when I moved to the East Coast, I did that all the time because we were truly curious, what are you? Are you Finn? What are you? And it really became something people would say to me, because don't ask these questions. I don't do that anyplace else. Bill.
The range is really known for its food, and you don't realize that as much when you're from here. And my wife was from up on the Canadian border, and she says to me one time, she says, we never ate the peas. I said, what are you talking about, the peas? She says, porchetta, pasties. She never had that until she moved down here. Didn't even know what it was. And we take it for, it's just, everybody knows what that is.
Well, I'm a mixed breed myself. My mother's family was Slovenian, was German beginning in a Slovenian town in Slovenia, but my grandmother, my mom's mother, lived in Fintown. So she had so many friends that were Finns. My father, I'm an Urtebek, Arielitz, and I'm sure you know the name. My father played he sang in polka mass and the Slovenian men's choraliers. Loved Dr. China. He loved Dr. China. He just passed away recently, but we grew up with the music and the festivals and the Vinska Targata and the KSKJ, and the music was so important in our family. My grandfather had a Murvar, and the real Murvar. Another thing that my family did an awful lot of was they made hooch. They made wine and sold it illegally. My father remembers his father running from the revenuers. That's the fastest my father had ever been in a vehicle. His father was driving. My family are Snitteriches. And my dad...
Well, then we're cousins, I think, aren't
My
we?
dad's...
Yes.
My dad is the oldest of the Snitterich generation. His mother was a Snitterich. And Johnny Snitterich is my father's cousin. He's the youngest. So just to... Val and Frank attended my father's funeral, and Johnny Snitterich played on his diatonic accordion. He played Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain. He played Flava Ochi in the Rain at my father's funeral. So it's wonderful to hear this, their speeches, and just the wonderful heritage that my family has lived here on the range.
The Iron Range is a spectacularly interesting part of the world, there's no question about it. And so it's wonderful to talk about it tonight. And I want to say, hope that you'll come. We thought we would do music tonight, but you know it got to be too long. And we're going to have the most interesting combined lecture and musical experience tomorrow night in Aurora, and here again on Saturday, when we're going to talk about the strike and the labor movement, and then have a half a program or a significant program that's all about social justice music, protest music that goes all the way from Negro spirituals to Bob Dylan. So it's going to be really marvelous. Come and hear that one.